Hey everybody, welcome to the lecture for chapter 6. Today we're going to talk about how the environment has been built, the urban environment has been built, how that impacts fire, and how that's led to some shifts in what we read about in chapter 7 and how we think through what fire is. Um, it is a luxury in a lot of places to be able to have an open flame like a fireplace or a hearth, like we used to have in the old days as our primary heating and cooking source. We've really spent a lot of time over the last 200 years capturing fire and controlling fire in ways that, we don't even think about fire today, but your cooking, your heat, your hot water, all of these are ways that we've captured and internalized fire in our lived environments. And this is partially due to how society has been developed over time, how our lived space has been developed over time. And today we're going to be talking about those types of concepts. So really delving into the society part of fire and society. And so for the purposes of this lecture, we're really going to be focusing on that built environment. All right, so we've talked about the fire triangle, and that's really important. The three components of what we need to have in order to have fire. So that's fuels, oxygen, and a spark. But there's another triangle because fire people are big on triangles, and this is the fire behavior triangle. And this is really important for us when we think in terms of how do we fight fire, how do we control fire, how do we tame fire, how do we contain fire, is understanding how fire behaves. So there are three components that are part of this fire behavior triangle. So just like with the other fire triangle, fuels is really important. But in this case, it's the amount of fuels, the arrangement of the fuels, and how much moisture is in a fuel. The less moisture, the easier the fuel is to burn. So if you've ever tried to make a fire and all you have is wet leaves and wet grass and wet sticks, you mostly get smoke. You don't get a lot of fire. And that's because there's way too much moisture in that fuel. The second component of this is weather. We know that there's a whole lot of ways that weather impacts fire, especially here in California. We used to talk about this idea of a fire season. Now, apparently all year round is fire season. And that's because of the weather that we have. Things that firefighters think of often are wind, temperature, humidity, and precipitation, right? So precipitation, if you're putting out a wildfire, is a friend. If you're trying to start a fire or you're trying to burn something as part of your industry, too much precipitation may not be your friend. Wind is a driving factor of fire. When you have a windy day, you're much more likely to have fire spread. And that's both in the wildlands as well as in the urban environment. And one of the videos you're watching for this week is about the Chicago fire, the big Chicago fire that happened in the 1800s. And one of the big factors that drove that was wind. And certainly a lot of the fires that we've experienced over the last couple of decades are wind-driven fires as well. And we can see when we look at the Thomas Fire or the Oakland Hills Fire or the CZU complex or quite a number of other fires that happen in these more urbanized spaces, is that wind is a driving factor to get sparks to new fuels. And an ember can actually travel as far as a mile and still be able to start a new fire. So if you're fighting a fire in the wildland urban interface and that those sparks get picked up and driven into a community, well, now you've got a whole new type of fire. You've got a community fire. And then of course there's topography. So steeper slopes are more likely to drive wind up and fires more likely to follow them. If you have a canyon, you're creating basically a chimney effect, and that can drive the fire as well. So where people put their homes, how we design communities, it's really important for us to think through what that looks like and how we can think through preventing fires. If your house is too close to the edge of a cliff or a steep canyon, you might have an amazingly spectacular view, but your house is a lot more likely to be caught in an updraft of a fire than if your house was set back quite a ways. So we do have a video link here. I am going to actually post this into the Canvas course shell. This is about fire behavior. It's about 15 minutes. You're definitely going to want to watch it because it talks you through how firefighters are thinking through that fire behavior. And that's going to be really important in order to be able to understand what's going on in terms of fire. So in addition to that fire triangle, urban spaces are built for fire and are often victimized by fire. So as humans started to settle down in agriculture, we really started to bring fire into our homes through hearths, right? So these are fireplaces. But the hearth was more than just, I'm going to warm up my house. This was a space we were cooking. This is the gathering space. This is how we're warming our entire structures. And so how we built our homes was often built around how we were going to be able to use this fire in a strategic way. So if you ever go to homes from the earlier than the 1800s, built in the late 1800s or earlier, a lot of times these homes are 2 stories. And what they have is on the bottom floor, they'll have their fireplace in the kitchen. They may have another one in the main living area. But if you look up in the ceilings of those rooms, you'll actually see round cutouts. And this would allow families at night to open up these holes, and the warm air from those lower levels would actually be able to come up and heat up the bedrooms and keep them warm at night as the fires were dying out. This meant they didn't have to also try and construct fireplaces on the second floor. Now, if you ever go to a castle or something like that, especially over in Europe, you'll see that they actually built fireplaces everywhere because they didn't use necessarily those types of technologies in these large stone structures, because stone doesn't burn as much as wood did. So if you could actually afford to build a stone structure, you were actually better off in terms of not having your house burned down. One of the things that we faced a lot is making sure that those hearths were fireproof. And so people would build those hearths out of stone and chimney out of stone, but you had to be really conscientious of cracks in that mason work or any flaws in that mason work or building up of soot in that mason work, because that can actually set your house on fire. And that's actually something we face today when we think through traditional fireplaces. I mean, you have to really be conscientious of making sure those chimneys are cleaned out and that your flues are working correctly, and that nobody's nested up at the top of your chimney and there's no dead animals that fell in there. These are all problems that people with fire chimneys face as we built homes around fire. So these fireplaces are the centerpiece of a lot of homes because functionally they provide heat, food, comfort, etc. And of course, materials matter greatly. One of the things that we've seen over the last couple decades in California is changes in our building regulations around the materials that we use. So historically, we used whatever we could find. If all you could find was wood, then you built a wood structure. If you could find some stones to create that hearth, great. Otherwise, you risked your structure actually burning up. And of course, the more you heat your structure, the drier that wood gets. So if you're able to keep a decent fire going the whole time, you're drying out the wood in your home, which of course makes it more flammable. So you really have to be conscientious of how you're constructing these spaces in order to ensure fire stays as your friend, not your foe, if you will. And of course, the environment has a huge impact. Some wood is less flammable than other woods. We've talked about how redwoods don't burn as well as other types of woods. And of course, if you're in a place that's more tropical, your need for a thicker house is going to be different than somebody up in the northern climes, where they're going to need a thicker house where they can keep fire out, where you might be thinking in terms of, how do I build a house that's going to keep me cool? And so the environment in which these spaces are built in plays a big factor too. And also, what skill sets different people in your community bring can also impact how these homes are built, how well insulated they are, and how well they stand up against fire. Now, when we think through the internal structure of a home, the unit we often think of where fire begins is a room. So the room itself is the basic unit of any structure, regardless of what that structure is, whether it's a house or a store or an office building or a skyscraper. The basic unit we talk about is the room and how this room is structured, what materials are in this room, how the fuels are placed in this room, all really impacts fire spread in this room. So we're going to watch a short video on a fire that's spreading in a room. And what I want you to be thinking about with this is a couple things. One, here's where the fire is starting. Here's the fireplace. Now look at how this material is spread around the room, the curtains, the door over here, what the ceiling looks like, the materials that are used in this area, right? There's a lot of synthetic materials in here. These all play an important part in how fire spreads in a room. If a room is the basic unit, then understanding how fire spreads in a room can also help us understand how fire is going to spread throughout a structure and then across structures. So we're going to watch this pretty short video. It's about 2 minutes. We're going to talk through it as we go. So here you can see the fire starting. These people have hung things to dry. Also up here, we have stuff on the top of the mantle, and we have a chair pretty close to this fireplace. Now we can see we're starting to get flames. Now these flames are dripping on part of the hearth, but the rug goes right up to that hearth. The other thing that's happening here is there's heat building up all along the top of this room. So that heat is really important, because remember, heat is part of the process of fire. And there's going to come a critical point here where that room is going to get hot enough that we're starting to reach an ignition point of other materials in the room. Take a look at these curtains here, right? These curtains, as a plasticky material, are more likely to start getting a little bit scorched. And you see how this is spreading. Look at that. You can start to see that lamp moving because of that flame. See all the smoke building up. The scorching spreading over here. And once it reaches a pretty critical ignition point, lots of things start to go pretty quickly. You can see how we can not see as well these upper areas as this smoke builds up. Oh, there's the curtains going. You can see the curtains starting to melt. You can see this starting to shrivel up as the heat gets big enough, and now we've got ignition across the room. Notice it's traveling on the ceiling. That's how it's spreading out. Oh, there's the window breaking. Now the whole room is engulfed. That only took 2 minutes. pretty quick. We know that once a room goes, if the doors are open, that heat is able to spread throughout the house. One of the important things we know about fire spreading throughout a house is that if you want to give yourself more time, make sure you sleep with your door closed at night, because that door actually provides a decent barrier in order to protect you against that heat and that smoke coming through the house. So that's kind of a basic fire safety tip, is make sure that your door is closed. And of course, that was set up to catch on fire, right? There's intentionality in order to create this video. But a lot of people don't even think about the little things like, where is my space heater in relationship to clothes, papers, other things like that could get too hot and catch on fire? People don't really think through those things, just kind of chuck things on the floor. So one of the things you're going to do this week is you're actually going to do a fire assessment. And that is the weekly activity that we have for this week. So I want you to look at your house and your rooms and your spaces and really assess what's going on in terms of flammability, escapability, that sort of stuff. All right, back to the... So like I said, the room is the basic unit that we start to understand in order for fire to occur and fire to actually shift and flow throughout a structure. All fires that start in a structure start in a room. So that's really important to remember. So once it escapes the room and it engulfs the structure, we have a structural fire, right? This whole thing is a structural fire. But what happens after that structure's on fire, and whether that spreads to other structures, really depends upon how that community is developed. And so we're going to spend the rest of the time in this lecture talking about the different ways communities develop over time and how that has an impact on what's going on and how fire spreads in communities. So when we think through how urban areas develop, there's usually 3 different ways that we talk about that. We have the concentric ring model, the sector model, and the multiple nuclear model. Most historic big cities, especially on the East Coast, in the Midwest, and in Europe, really followed the concentric ring model. So I'm going to talk through that a little bit in detail. So the concentric ring model has 5 zones once the town is completely built up. So we have this central business zone. So we have this central business zone. Now, these central business zones usually start out as a few stores, the old country stores, surrounded by houses. And as the city grows up, the homes start to move out of those central areas and they start to spread out more. So this central business zone usually becomes what we think of as a traditional downtown area. We can think of that in SLO, but if you were to go out to like New York City or Chicago or Baltimore or London or Paris, you have a very clear downtown area. Now, what you want to have in your downtown area is things that attract people into your downtown. So this is going to be stores, museums, restaurants, cutesy things, etc. But as we start to especially hit the Industrial Revolution, we start to see these towns start to expand. So as you have your central business district, the homes start to push out because people don't want to necessarily live in that downtown area. Lots of pollution, congestion, especially as we move from horses to cars and things like that. So they start to move out. So these communities burst out from the central business district to this commuter residential zone. What we have here in this zone 2 is what we call the transition zone. So this is usually right outside the central business area. And this is where we might put dirtier industries, waste management, transit, manufacturing. Back in the old days, that's where all your slaughterhouses would be. Yes, even in cities like New York, it was full of slaughterhouses. Your tanneries, your smith works, all of these are going to be in the zone of transition. And then the people who work in those industries usually are going to live right by them. So you actually might get community development in this zone around these industries. Remember, transportation is your feet. As people can start to afford other forms of transportation, they'll start to move themselves out into this blue collar residential zone. This is where the people who work in these areas are able to afford to be a little bit farther away from the pollution. But these are definitely more working class areas because it takes money for transportation. Homes in this zone 2 and zone 3 tend to be less high quality, fairly close together. You're more likely to see tenements and walk-ups and apartment buildings and things like that in these areas. As we start to create a middle class, there was a long time where there wasn't such a thing as a middle class. We start to create these more suburban areas, right? These are single family homes. They do have a little bit of land around them, not a ton. So there's a little bit more space between these houses. Maybe there's a good 10, 15 feet in between houses. So it's not a lot of space, but some space. These are usually single family homes. There's not a lot of apartment complexes in there. And then of course your residential commuter zones, this is really digging into your suburbs, right? So you might be on half-acre plots. You have fairly substantial single family homes with 4 or 5 bedrooms. Some of you may have grown up in these areas. And then past that, you have your ex-urban areas. Now, this is important when we think through fire spread. The closer structures are together, the more likely they are, if one catches on fire, for another to catch on fire. So we're much more likely to get fire intensity in these areas, particularly if it's not a wind-driven fire. If it's a wind-driven fire, we're talking a whole other thing. We're going to talk about that more when we talk about the wildland-urban interface. So a lot of these towns start to be built up like this, right? So let's look at some of the things that we need to consider. These are all wood construction. They are out, this is actually Tombstone. So it's out in the Arizona desert. So guess what? It's hot and it's dry, and these timbers are going to dry out much quicker. And so are the roofs, and they're all attached together. And it's very cute and folksy. And if one of these places catch on fire, it can spread very rapidly throughout this whole town. Even here, this is another old town. Once again, we have lots of wood structures. There's a little bit of space between them, but certainly not a lot. So this space becomes an important part of a fire break. The more space you can have between structures, the less likely they are to catch on fire. As we saw with that room video, there's a critical point where the things on the farthest side of the room start to catch fire. The same thing happens when we're looking at how fire spreads from structure to structure. The farther apart they are, the less likely they are to catch on fire. So these buildings are certainly less likely to catch on fire than these are, because these are right up next to each other. And so when we think in terms of how cities are built, you know, these central areas that we had, both this city center where we're going to see things pretty packed, as well as this more industrialized zone where we have active fire, right? Like these are places where fire in industry is still being used, and you have sparks flying and everything like that. So you want to really make sure your construction material is good. And then in this zone 3 as well, these homes are pretty close together. So fire is much more likely to spread. And I bring up this concentric zonal model because when you watch the Chicago fire video that you're watching this week, this is how Chicago is developed. I mean, like, granted, it's kind of cut off right here, and I have a slide and a couple slides that kind of shows you that, but it developed in this way. The second way that we have is kind of this sector model. So the sector model we see depending upon how things develop. Again, we have a central business district, but rather than these clear building out of zones, we kind of get these elongated zones, right? So might be the business park. Here is the lower class residential areas. They're kind of divided up. Once again, these are going to be places where much more likely to have fire emerge. Over here, we're looking at middle class residential. This might be an industrial park. You might have some heavy industry in other places. We usually think of this as more of a pie shaped, and Seattle is very much built in this particular way. So we have high income areas along fashionable boulevards and waterways where you kind of have that prestige, and you certainly have some of that integration with retail. And of course, if these are being developed during the Industrial Revolution and we have industry is going to actually be developed along the waterways because water release and pollution release into rivers was definitely a thing. And you also know you have too much, if you are like the city of Columbus, Ohio, where your river caught on fire 6 times, you might have too much pollution in it. But once again, we have these homes that are fairly packed together. If this guy catches on fire in these are your kind of working class, lower residential. If a fire catches here, it's much more easy to spread because we just don't have that spacing in order to give us some fire buffers. But we do have a bit more intermixing in this way. And so that can be really helpful in terms of where your barriers and buffers are. And then the final way that we see some cities, this is definitely post-World War II, in the early days of suburbanization, we'll see multiple nuclei modes of development. So these are your car cities. We see these on the West Coast. This is your LAs and your San Diegos and places like that. And your San Jose's get multi-nuclei. So these are definitely, this is the car city. These are cities that weren't developed with centralized transportation, but were built for the car. And so there's a push for everybody to live in these decentralized zones. One of the things that does is it spaces out the housing a bit. And again, you may not see this very clear central core business district. You actually may have multiple central core business districts. So if you look at a city like San Jose, and some of you may be from San Jose, you do have this downtown, but then you have these other sort of towns that happen in these neighborhoods, like Willow Glen, or up on by the mall on Winchester Boulevard, where you have these multiple nuclei that serve kind of this downtown function, surrounded by these lower and middle class housing developments. Again, these areas that are more densely packed are more likely to have fire spread. One of the good things is because you're creating these multiple nuclei, is that you're intermixing some of that spacing, you're breaking up that flow of homes and structured areas, you're sticking more of these cement buildings in there. That's going to help take out some of the fire and put in some additional fire breaks. And then we have the suburban areas. So once again, the suburbs, they're all about the combustion engine and the single family home. And here we have a pretty typical suburban area, right? This is your ticky-tack homes. They all look pretty much the same, and they're built by the same company. And we see the development of these communities all occur at the same time. And we're actually seeing this happen here in San Luis Obispo. We have a number of neighborhoods that are being constructed. And these neighborhoods are going to have a similar feel, similar architecture, similar design, similar spacing. And so when we consider these areas and how they relate to fire, we can think in terms of fire being able to be a bit more contained. So if this house here catches on fire, look at all this area around it. There's a bigger buffer space. You tend to have lower fuel loads between houses and a greater distance. You might have actual trees and stuff close to the home, but you have all of these breaks here that allow for a lot of containment. And this is actually where we start to see the development of what we call the wildland urban interface. And this is a very intentional design element, flaw, a little bit of both, because these fuels here, if they're not taken care of properly, become a real potential intrusion into a wildland fire. And then finally, we have the exurban area. So exurbia is usually a mix of homes scattered on pretty marginal farms. Here's a good example. So here, this is actually in Arroyo Grande. You can see all of these wild areas with the occasional house. These houses are usually on 5 to 10 acre plots, so they're spaced far apart. Here's a farm itself. You can see here's a few houses clustered together. This is actually at the top of the hill. This is Carpenter Canyon Road. There's farms over here. So you can see what this wildland, what this exurbia looks like. A fire in this space is much more likely to resemble a fire in a wildland than it is going to look like a fire in a city. And that's because of how this spacing is. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Chicago. So this is Chicago, and you're going to watch that video. You can see how dense the urban construction is, even from the start. So here's the 1900s. This is the city center of Chicago. And you can see how it spreads over these counties over time. So this is what Chicago actually looked at around the time that the Chicago fire happens. And part of what we want to think about when we think through urban fires is the idea that there's high fuel loads that are close together. This leads to fire spread. You can see how dense this developed area is. And if you've got properties that are overgrown, people aren't keeping up their properties, you just increase the fuel loads. And of course, back in the 1900s, roofs are wood. Like these are shake roofs. So you've got fire going on inside, drying everything out, and that allows for this spread of fire. But you can see here I wanted to show you this because this is what the urban development looks like when we think of those concentric zones. Once you start, by the way, to get size of urban development this big, you really do go from a concentric zonal model to either a sector or a multiple nuclei model, because it's just going to take way too long for the people that live here to go to the grocery store downtown. So you're more likely to get these multiple nuclei. Again, the development is going to help set what the fuel loads look like as we go ahead and space out all these homes. So that's a little bit about how urban fire spreads. We have a video on the Chicago fire for you to watch so you can learn a little bit more about that. And I hope you have a lovely day.